My understanding of Archbishop Viganò's position, which I summarize in part 1 of my article at 1 Peter 5, is essentially Vigano believes that Francis is not the Pope based on 4 allegations. Most recently, in his interview with Dr. Taylor Marshall, Vigano says that Benedict XVI's resignation was, quote, certainly invalid. So neither JP2 nor Benedict XVI held him to be a heretic publicly, nor did they ever warn him that he needed to recant from heretical positions.
Because we all know, because McCarrick boasted about lobbying for Bergoglio. He got on, there's a video of him just...
By the way, my name is Joe McClain. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
Speaking of good times, I don't know if you've read the article over at 1peter5.com, Archbishop Viganò and the question of Pope Francis. It's a great article, very detailed, and its second part is dropping today over there at 1peter5.com. We've invited the author, Matt Gaspers, to be on the team today and discuss it. Matt, good morning to you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Joe. Good to be back.
It's kind of a contentious issue, right? Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano recently declared excommunicated by the Vatican. Let's start there before we dive into the details of his position on Pope Francis. The excommunication itself, was it a formal excommunication, or did they say it was an automatic based on his positions?
Yeah, basically it's automatic, in Latin late sententiae, and it's attached to the canonical crime of schism, which the Vatican says Archbishop Viganò is guilty of for certain statements of his, including a rejection of Francis as the true pope and breaking communion with him, which Archbishop Viganò clearly has done in his public statements recently, specifically his statement, the Accuse, that was published on June 28th, in which he says that Pope Francis is not the Pope due to basically my understanding of Archbishop Viganò's position, which I summarize in part 1 of my article at 1 Peter 5, is essentially Viganò believes that Francis is not the Pope based on 4 allegations. Number 1, what he calls serious irregularities in the 2013 conclave. And I tried to list them in the order in which he's brought them up over the last several months or so. So serious irregularities in the conclave, defect of consent in accepting his election in 2013. He also claims Francis was guilty of heresy prior to his election and thus was ineligible. Most recently, in his interview with Dr. Taylor Marshall, Vigano says that Benedict XVI's resignation was, quote, certainly invalid, meaning that the See of Rome was not actually vacant when Francis was elected. So I try to respond to all 4 of those in part 1 of this series. And then in part 2, I'm going to get more into the theology of peaceful and universal acceptance of a man as the Pope, which basically is very much connected to something called a dogmatic fact, that it becomes a dogmatic fact, which is a secondary object of the Church's infallibility, that if a man is peacefully and universally accepted, it's what, the famous Jesuit canonist Wernz Vidal call a sign and an infallible effect of a valid election. And it basically establishes the pontificate of that man as a dogmatic fact, something which is infallibly certain. So stay tuned for part 2, which drops in a couple hours.
Is Vigano's position the same as Dr. Ed Mazza's position? Because I've interviewed Dr. Mazza on that in the past, maybe just a few months back, really. I've had a couple of conversations with Dr. Ed Mazza, but how similar are the arguments?
I mean, it seems fairly similar. Archbishop Viganò, to my knowledge, it's the first time that Vigano has ever publicly stated that Benedict XVI's resignation was invalid. I suspected that he held that position, but I didn't know for sure until his statement in response to a question from Dr. Taylor Marshall. And that's obviously central to Dr. Ed Mazza's thesis. And I actually had a friendly debate with Ed earlier this year, back in April. You can find our debate on the website, CatholicFamilyNews.com, if you're interested, viewers are interested. But Yeah, I mean, I think up prior to the interview with Dr. Marshall, I think Vigano's position, especially in his accused statement from June 28th, he really focuses in that statement on Francis, allegedly being guilty of heresy prior to his election. If you read that statement, Archbishop Vigano quotes from a papal bull or an apostolic constitution from 1559, Pope Paul IV, called Cum ex apostolatos officio, which is that, if a man was a heretic prior to his election as pope, then the election is null and void, even if he was accepted by all the cardinals. The problem with that argument is that when a pope or a Catholic official talks about someone being guilty of heresy, they're talking about them being guilty based on the public judgment of the church, not on the private judgment of an individual. And the fact of the matter is, as I say in part 1 of my article at 1 Peter 5, neither John Paul II, who created Bergoglio a cardinal, I think in 2001, if I remember correctly, so neither JP2 nor Benedict XVI held him to be a heretic publicly, nor did they ever warn him that he needed to recant from heretical positions. And according to traditional theologians such as St. Robert Bellarmine, Cardinal Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, formal warnings from proper church authority are necessary in order to establish the fact that a man is a public heretic. A private claim from a private individual is not sufficient.
One of the things that I talked to Dr. Mazza about when we were discussing it a few months back, as I said, was, okay, listen, I'm not a canon lawyer. I'm not a great theologian. I'm not even a smart guy. But nonetheless, we are stuck with the pontificate by default, regardless of the technicalities of the conclave in 2013, because we all know, because McCarrick boasted about lobbying for Bergoglio. He got on. There's a video of him just talking about how much they lobbied for Bergoglio. The St. Gallimafi was proud to claim that they lobbied for him, which violates canon law. We know that. That's public knowledge. But neither here nor there. The whole world, except every government that I know of, accepts Pope Francis as the vicar of Christ and the leader of the Vatican, the head of the government in Vatican. As far as I know, every single cardinal on the planet does not contest his pontificate. They all claim he's the Pope. And the vast majority of the world's bishops have accepted him as the Pope. So it almost seems like that's the final card that sort of trumps all these arguments, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fact of the matter is, as I say in my article, part 1, in regard to the violations of what you're talking about is violations of John Paul II's Apostolic Constitution, Universi Dominici Gregis, which is the special law of the church governing papal conclaves promulgated in 1996. In order to know with certainty that document was violated, which it certainly seems to have been, it's surely necessary for at least one eyewitness, presumably a cardinal elector, to publicly testify to that effect. And if we look at the standard of Scripture, it's 2 or 3 witnesses are necessary according to the book of Deuteronomy and 2 Corinthians. So in the absence of such eyewitness testimony, we can't assume that UDG was violated in such a way as to render the election of Francis null and void. And ultimately, as I say at the end of part 1, regardless of any of the particular arguments involved, whether you say that UDG was violated or Francis was guilty of heresy or whatever, other serious irregularities, the belief that Francis is not the Pope is ultimately contradicted by one simple fact that you just summarized. He was peacefully and universally accepted as the true Pope by the entire church following his election and acceptance of office on March 13th, 2013. And in the words of Cardinal Louis Bilot, he died in 1931. He was a renowned French theologian who served in the Holy Office under Pope St. Pius X. And I know that Dr. Mazza has quoted him as an authority in other matters, and I assume that Archbishop Viganò would recognize him as a theological authority. He says, the adhesion of the universal church will always in itself be an infallible sign of the legitimacy of a determined pontiff, and therefore also of the existence of all the conditions required for the legitimacy itself. And he goes on to say, and this quote is going to be included in part 2 of my series, therefore, from the moment in which the Pope is accepted by the Church and united to her as the head of the body, which obviously happened with Francis, it is no longer permitted to raise doubts about a possible vice of election or a possible lack of any condition whatsoever necessary for legitimacy. For the aforementioned adhesion of the Church heals in the root all fault in the election and proves infallibly the existence of all the required conditions. So in light of that teaching, which is not unique to Cardinal Billaud, it's shared by other canonists, other theologians, it is what it is. As you say, we're stuck in our circumstances. Now, it doesn't mean that Catholic prelates shouldn't be publicly resisting and correcting Francis for his, I think it's fair to say, objectively heretical statements, certain, which have been cataloged in such public statements as the Correctio Filialis back in 2018. And even in 2016, there was a theological critique of Amoris Laetitia done by a group of international theologians. There was an open letter to the bishops of the Catholic Church in 2019, cataloging even more stuff. And then even earlier this year, there was a call for the resignation of Pope Francis, cataloging again all of these heretical statements of his. So there does need to be public resistance and some sort of what Cardinal Burke called back in 2016 a formal correction. So, but we can't just take it into our own hands to say he's not the Pope based on our own private judgment, essentially.
Exactly. Hey, we're coming down to the wire on our 25th anniversary celebration in Niagara Falls. It's going to be a big conference. There are still some general tickets you can still get. The VIP portion is sold out, but if you go to the stationofthecross.com, you can find the details. Click that banner. I'm giving the first talk of the day, and I'm going to tell you the story of Joey Ox, a Vatican spy during World War II, who collaborated with Pius XII to kill Hitler and overturn the government. Oh, yeah, it's a juicy story. You're not going to want to miss it. Go to the stationofthecross.com for those details. For Matt Gaspers is on the team today. We're having a conversation about his article at 1peter5.com, Archbishop Viganò, and the question of Pope Francis. We were just talking about the sort of the nuance of the arguments that might supply some response to those that claim that Pope Francis isn't legitimate Pope. I think they're great, fantastic arguments. There's a lot of detail in this article. Want to encourage you to check it out, 1peter5.com. But I don't think it can be said enough that just because I believe Pope Francis is in fact the legitimate Pope doesn't mean that I'm on board with everything that comes out of the Vatican these days. I'm not on Team Traditionis Custodes. I'm not on Team Fiducia Supplicans. I got issues with Amoris Laetitia and a lot of other things. And I don't think we can stand idly by and just say nothing. I feel like we have an obligation to recognize and resist. And Matt Gaspers, welcome back to the team. One of the things you point out in your article was that Vigano is saying, hey, you cardinals, I know you know that during that conclave there were issues and you said nothing. Why do you suppose that would be the case? If they did recognize and see and witness firsthand, say, the lobbying or other bigger issues, why didn't they say anything, and why don't they say things today?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think, first of all, I do want to emphasize, as I do in my article, that I continue to greatly esteem Archbishop Viganò. I'm very grateful to him for his courageous witness over the last 6 years. And I think he's done a lot of good in the church, obviously exposing former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and even the connection to Pope Francis, and then getting into the doctrinal realm in 2019 and 2020. His interventions have been huge, in my opinion, in the life of the church. So I still consider him to be an ally in fighting against what he calls the deep church. Just like there's a deep state, there's a deep church. But obviously I disagree with him on this particular issue. And in regard to why the cardinals wouldn't speak up, I mean, that's really anybody's guess. It's a matter of the internal forum at this point if they're not willing to share publicly their concerns. I mean, Vigano claims that they witnessed things. He told me this in an interview last August, which I quote in my article. What does he say here? He says, some cardinals who entered the conclave in 2013 do not seem to understand the gravity of what happened in the conclave and continues to happen. They supposedly witnessed facts that render the election of Jorge Mario null and void. The indiscretions of these cardinals focus on the evidence of serious irregularities without providing further details. And he says, I find it incomprehensible that a member of the College of Cardinals can confide to friends that he has witnessed these things that would render the election null and void. But I mean, here's the thing. According to the traditional theology, as I quoted in the last segment, even if those things happened, I mean, even if outright fraud happened, ultimately, as I quote in part 2, which comes out today, Cardinal Below was actually, who I quoted in the last segment, was just repeating something that the Saint Alphonsus Liguori taught. This is what he said. It is of no importance that in past centuries some pontiff was illegitimately elected or took possession of the pontificate by fraud. It is enough that he was accepted afterwards by the whole church, since by such acceptance he would have become the true pontiff. And that's St. Alphonsus Liguori talking, a doctor of the church. So I don't know why the cardinals have remained silent, but if there were shenanigans, even those serious enough to invalidate the election, it's really a moot point at this point, because peaceful and universal acceptance happened, and the pontificate of Francis, as I said, is established as a dogmatic fact, which I get into in part 2 of my article.
I'm told that there are a lot of cardinals or bishops around the world, maybe more than we realize, that do have serious concerns about this pontificate, but they aren't willing to speak publicly about that. Do you suppose that it's a speculation at best, but do you suppose that these bishops are simply hoping to wait it out? I mean, he's not a spring chicken. His health isn't great. It could be any day now, and we'll get a new conclave, and then everything will be better.
I would imagine that there are some who are banking on that, and that's why they remain silent. But I mean, they're really shirking their duty, to be completely frank. And I quote from St. Robert Bellarmine at the end of part 2. So he says in his treatise on the Church, De Ecclesia, he lists 6 reasons on account of which councils are celebrated. And the 4th reason, he says, is suspicion of heresy in the Roman pontiff, if perhaps it might happen. Now, Bellarmine, in his treatise on the Roman pontiff, admits that he holds the opinion of, I think, Albert Pigius, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, who held that it's impossible for a pope to fall into heresy even as a private person. He thought that that was a pious opinion and easily defended, but he did recognize that the common opinion is to the contrary. Bellarmine did. So it is, the common opinion is that it is possible for a pope to fall into heresy, not to teach it ex cathedra, but to fall into it and even to spread it without trying to define something infallibly that's heretical. So Bellarmine ultimately says, then if that is the case, if that were to happen, then a general council ought to be gathered either to depose the pope if he should be found to be a heretic through that process of formal warnings and correction, if he shows himself obstinate in the face of that, or Bellarmine says certainly to admonish him if he seemed incorrigible in morals. So as I conclude part 2, unless or until something like that happens where we get, what might be called an imperfect council or a consortium of cardinals and bishops willing to do their duty and correct the Pope, we have to continue recognizing him as the Pope and ultimately maintain communion with him. But we also have to understand that true obedience, which is owed first and foremost to God, includes the lawful resistance of human superiors, even the Pope, when the faith and souls are at stake. And then I go on to quote from Aquinas and Bellarmine on that point. And in regard to true obedience, go ahead.
I was going to say, we're going to run out
Yeah, I
of
was
time
just
here in
gonna-
a minute on the radio side. I'd like to continue the conversation in the after show if you've still got time. But I want to sneak one more thing in here before we run out for the radio side, and that is excommunication. Excommunication feels like a heavy hand. It feels like a big deal. But is it the final word? I would say Joan of Arc might have something to say about that. What say you, Matt Gaspers?
Well, yeah, I mean, excommunication by its very nature obviously can be lifted. It's not like a permanent, irreversible thing that you're cut off from the church forever, regardless of your position or anything. And, you know, we're living in an unprecedented crisis in the church. I think Pope Francis, the man Bergoglio, is kind of the epitome of the crisis that's been building for decades now. So, you know, we live in uncommon times. I think it's not unusual for people to fall into like going to extremes. But what I like to remind myself of, I think it's in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 5, where it's either God telling this to Moses or Moses to the people of Israel. Stay in the middle. I'm paraphrasing. Don't deviate either to the right or to the left. Stay in the middle. And that's what I'm trying to do here.
Amen. Well said. I am too, by the way. Praise be to God.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.